Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to never miss a story from America's forgotten past. Now, let's step back into time and uncover the dark secrets of the Durnham family, hidden in the walls for 93 years. The year was 1857, and the town of Clayton, Alabama, was like so many others scattered across the rolling countryside of the South. Small farms stretched out in all directions, red clay roads twisted and coiled under the heavy sun, and the sound of cicadas filled the evenings with their endless hum. Life was slower then, but it was not easier. Families rose with the dawn and worked the fields until sweat soaked through their shirts. Children fetched water from wells, women sewed by lamplight, and men carried the weight of land and labor on their shoulders. It was in this quiet town that the Durnham family carved out their place. They were neither the wealthiest or the poorest, nor the poorest nor the most invisible, but in time their name would carry with it the kind of whisper that people did not want to repeat out loud. The Durnhams were a proud family. Old roots, they said, roots that reached back before Alabama had even become a state. They settled on the edge of town where the trees grew thick and where the land sloped into a hollow where mist gathered in the morning. The house itself was a sturdy two-story structure built of pine boards cut by hand. Its timbers were joined with care, its chimneys rose tall, and its windows stared like watchful eyes toward the road. From the outside it looked like any other farmhouse, but inside, within its walls, lay a secret that would not come to light for almost a century. At the head of Teves, Rebute, the head of the family, was Samuel Durnham, a man known for his quiet authority. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and always wore a dark coat. Even in the summer heat he spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried weight. Beside him was his wife, Margaret, a woman of sharp eyes and quick temper. She was known in church for her strictness, in the market for her careful hand with money, and in the home for her unyielding order. They had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, and, like most families of the time, their lives revolved around the cycles of planting and harvest, of church meetings and community gatherings, of births and funerals. But there was something about the Durnhams that set them apart. People could not name it outright, but they felt that there was a heaviness in that house on the edge of town, a kind of shadow that seemed to follow its inhabitants. Samuel often kept his children close, rarely letting them wander far from the property. Margaret's temper was sharper than most. She scolded not just her own children, but sometimes even other people's, and the children themselves, though well-dressed and well-fed, rarely laughed as children should. The first whispers began with the oldest daughter, Clara. She was 16 in the summer of 1859, when she suddenly disappeared. At first it was said she had run away to Mobile to live with a cousin. Some even whispered she might have been courted by a traveling salesman and left to start a new life. But as weeks turned to months and no letter came and no word was heard, the whispers grew louder. Why would a girl like Clara leave without taking anything with her? No clothing, no jewelry, no keepsakes. And why did her parents never speak her name again? Life in Clayton went on as life always does. Even tragedy could not stop the turning of the seasons. Another harvest came, another winter passed, and soon another spring blossomed. But those who lived near the Durnham farm swore that after Clara vanished, something changed. In that house, curtains that had once been drawn back to let in the morning light were kept closed far longer than before. Samuel stopped attending Sunday service regularly. Margaret grew more severe, and the younger children walked about with eyes that seemed older than their years. The second daughter, Anna, vanished 3 years later. She too was 16. When neighbors asked Margaret where she had gone, Margaret simply said she had been sent to stay with relatives further west. The matter was dropped, at least publicly, but in private voices trembled as they wondered aloud how 2 daughters from not the same family could both vanish at the same age. The Durnhams never gave a straight answer, and no one in town had ever seen these supposed relatives in the West. Still, no one dared to accuse the family outright. The Durnhams were not to be crossed. Samuel's stern silence alone was enough to keep most men's tongues behind their teeth by the time the Civil War tore through the South in the 1860s. The Durnhams had grown even more withdrawn while young. Men of the county marched off to fight. Samuel kept his sons close, claiming that farm work was their battle and that someone had to keep food growing. Margaret kept her remaining daughter under a strict and watchful eye, and neighbors said they rarely saw her at all. The war brought hunger and loss to every doorstep, yet strangely, the Durnham farm never seemed to suffer as much as others. Their barns were full, their smokehouse stocked, and while some children went barefoot in town, the Durnham boys still wore sturdy boots. There was talk of hoarding and worse talk of dealings that decent people did not want to imagine when the war ended and the world changed around them. The Durnhams remained almost exactly as they had been before. Withdrawn, proud and quiet, two daughters had vanished, and no one dared to ask questions aloud. The youngest girl, Mary, was the last. She reached 16 in the spring of 1868, and by summer, she too was gone. That was when people stopped pretending they believed the Durnhams' explanations. 3 daughters, 3 vanishings, all at the same age. It was too much. Some said the girls had been sent away to distant family. Some said they had been hidden away for shameful reasons. Some went further still, whispering of darker things, of sins too heavy to speak in daylight. But what no one could deny was that the Durnhams never sought help, never asked for searches, never placed notices, and never allowed townsfolk inside their home for even the smallest gathering. What was inside that house was theirs and theirs alone. And so the house grew older and the secret deeper with each passing year. Time is a strange thing in small towns. Years pass slowly, day by day, but when you look back, whole decades seem to vanish in a blink. By the turn of the century, the Durnham name carried with it an air of mystery and unease. Children dared each other to run up and touch the front steps of the house and then run away screaming. Farmers shook their heads when they saw Samuel's surviving sons drive wagons into town, still strong, still silent, still keeping to themselves. The Durnham daughters were all gone, yet their shadows lingered in the minds of everyone who lived nearby. It was in 1912 when the first cracks appeared in the silence. Samuel had been dead many years. Margaret to the house now belonged to the sons who lived there unmarried and alone. One summer, a storm tore through the county, and lightning struck the old pine tree that leaned against the Durnham house. When the tree splintered, it broke through part of the roof, and townsfolk came to help repair it. For the first time in nearly half a century, outsiders stepped inside the Durnham home, and what they saw unsettled them. The rooms were dark. Even at noon, curtains were nailed shut. The air smelled of mildew and something older, the kind of smell that clings to places untouched by sunlight. The walls themselves seemed to thicker than a house of that size required. Some remarked it felt like walking into a cave rather than a home. The brothers were tense, watching every hand that touched their belongings, every footstep that crossed their floors. When the work was finished, the men left quickly, glad to feel fresh air on their faces again, and no one spoke much of what they had seen yet. From that day, the whispers grew bolder. What had been hidden inside that house? What secret could explain the vanished girls and the sealed curtains and the heavy, thick walls? The answer would not come until 1950, almost 100 years after Clara had first disappeared. By then, the house was empty. The last of the Durnham brothers had died, with no history. Children of their own, the property sat abandoned, dust collecting over everything, windows broken by time, paint peeling from the boards. The town debated whether to tear it down or restore it, and in the end, it was sold to a man from Montgomery who wanted to clear the land for cattle. He hired workers to dismantle the old farmhouse piece by piece, board by board. It was then, when the first wall was broken open, that the truth began to seep out. What they found hidden inside those walls had been waiting silently for 93 long years. The first hammer blow against the old pine boards echoed like thunder inside the hollowed remains of the Durnham home. Dust rained down from the rafters, and the smell of rot rose like a ghost. The men who had been hired to tear down the house were not locals, and perhaps that was the only reason they worked as quickly as they did. For anyone who had grown up in Clayton, the Durnham place was more than an abandoned farmhouse. It was a place of stories and shadows, a place avoided by children, and passed by with lowered voices. The outsiders, though, only saw a job to be done. Boards groaned as they were pried away, revealing not the empty hollow that most walls held, but a dark space deeper than expected. One of the men cursed under his breath as his crowbar slipped into a gap and clattered against something that sounded solid, not like wood, not like brick, but like metal. A lantern was brought close, and in the dim flicker they saw a small chest wedged between beams, sealed with rusted iron. A murmur spread among them, curiosity stirred by the thought of forgotten money or relics. Hidden treasure, perhaps. That was a word the men liked, but when the chest was dragged into the open and pried apart, the excitement drained away. Like water through cracked earth, inside there were no coins, no silver, no deeds. Instead, there were scraps of cloth faded to gray, strands of hair, still tied with ribbon and pressed flat between. Brittle paper. There were letters, to dozens of them, written in a woman's hand, all unsigned, all addressed, not to a name, but to a word that made the men's skin crawl. Mother. The letters were short, desperate things. The ink was smudged as though tears had soaked the paper. Words repeated over and over. Please let me out. I promise to obey. I am cold. I am hungry. I will not speak to anyone. Please do not leave me here alone. Each letter carried the same pleading tone, as if the writer had been trapped with only paper to keep her company. The men glanced at one another, uneasy in the silence of that ruined house. They did not speak of treasure. Again the work slowed. After that, each wall they opened seemed to hide something else, not always a chest, but sometimes a bundle of clothing wrapped tightly and stuffed deep into the frame. Sometimes a small pair of shoes, caked with dust. Sometimes a hairbrush with strands still clinging to its bristles. None of it made sense at first, and yet every object carried with it a weight heavier than stone. It was not until they broke open the wall behind what had once been the parlor that the true horror revealed itself. The boards splintered outward with a crack, and the lantern light spilled into a cavity taller than a man and just wide enough for someone to stand upright. Inside, pressed against the wood, was a shape pale and shriveled by time, yet still unmistakably human. The men staggered back, their tools clattering to the floor. The thing inside had once been a young woman. Her hair, long and tangled, clung like cobwebs to her skull. Her dress, though tattered, still held the delicate stitching of another century. The sockets where eyes had once been stared blankly through the gloom. The body had been sealed there, untouched, undisturbed. For decades, shock rippled through the crew. Some swore and turned away, others crossed themselves with trembling hands. A foreman sent for the sheriff, and by the time word spread through Clayton, the Durnham place was alive with lanterns. The sheriff, an old man named Thomas Miller, had lived long enough to remember the whispers of missing daughters. He remembered, too, how folks avoided asking questions about the Durnhams, and how the silence had hung heavy like a shroud when he looked into the cavity in that wall and saw the preserved remains of a girl no older than 16. He knew at once that the whispers had not been just stories. Over the next days, more walls came down, and with each came another discovery. By the time the work was finished, they had uncovered 3 bodies. All of them young girls, all hidden in the very bones of the house. Each wore clothing of a different decade, but each had the same haunting features: hair still braided or tied with ribbon, dresses stitched by careful hands. These were not strangers. They were the missing daughters of the Durnham family, Clara, Anna, and Mary, sealed away by their own kin. The truth that had been whispered for nearly 100 years was now staring openly at the people of Clayton, and the town would never be the same again. The sheriff kept the house under guard as investigators from Montgomery arrived. They studied the remains, They studied the letters, and they studied the structure of the house itself they found. Small crawl spaces carved between walls narrow enough for a child, but suffocating for anyone trapped inside. They found scratch marks along the beams where fingernails had clawed in vain. They found hair pressed into the cracks where heads had leaned for too long against wooden boards. Every discovery painted a picture more horrifying than the last, and yet one question lingered above them all. Why would Samuel and Margaret Durnham wall away their daughters one by one? What drove parents to such cruelty? Some suggested madness. Perhaps Margaret's strictness had rotted into obsession. Perhaps Samuel's silence had hidden a sickness of mind. Others whispered of superstition, of some twisted belief that demanded sacrifice to keep misfortune from the land. A few even suggested darker things altogether, unholy things, deals struck with forces no Christian tongue dared to name. But no matter the cause, the evidence was plain. The Durnhams had imprisoned their own children within the very walls of their home and left them there to die. The town was shaken to its core. Old men who had once courted Clara or Anna wept openly in the street. Women who remembered Margaret in her stern black dresses shuddered at the thought of what she must have done behind closed doors. Families who had grown up warning their children not to wander near the Durnham place now realized that the warnings had been more than just superstition. They had been echoes of truth, echoes buried beneath silence and fear. The funerals were unlike any Clayton had ever seen. Though nearly a century had passed since the girls had been born, the town buried them with full rites. Wooden caskets were lined side by side and draped in white cloth. As the church bells tolled solemnly, mourners gathered in droves, not because they had known the girls in life, but because they had carried their absence in memory. For so long, flowers were laid upon the graves, tears streaked down faces, and prayers rose into the hot Alabama air. It was not only a burial, it was a confession, a way for the town to admit what it had always suspected but never dared to face. Even as the graves were filled with earth and the bells grew silent, questions still lingered. For if the daughters had been hidden in the walls, who had written the letters? Who had slipped those desperate pleas into the cracks and sealed them with ribbon? And were there more secrets still within that house? Perhaps even more bodies waiting to be found. The men who had torn down the walls swore they had searched every inch, but some swore that, late at night, when the wind blew through the hollow, you could still hear faint scratching, as if the house itself was not yet finished telling its story. In Montgomery, the newspapers seized upon the discovery. The headlines screamed of horror. In Clayton, Alabama, they spoke of a century-old crime of daughters, walled alive, of secrets festering behind plaster and pine. They compared the Durnhams to medieval tyrants and to the haunted houses of Gothic novels. Reporters flooded the town, interviewing anyone old enough to remember even a scrap of the Durnham story. They asked about Samuel's stern silence, about Margaret's sharp eyes, about the way the curtains had been nailed shut, and the way the children never laughed. And the more they asked, the more they realized that the signs had always been there, hiding in plain sight. But the Durnhams were gone now, their sons buried childless. Their line ended with them. There was no one left to answer for the crimes, no one left to explain what madness had taken hold in that house. People were left only with their imaginations and with the heavy truth that evil can hide in even the most ordinary of places, not in castles, not in faraway cities, but in the farmhouse down the road, the one with the nailed curtains and the silent children. 4 months, the remains of the house stood half torn apart, a skeleton of beams and molossed, and beams and moloss in moloss. Molly said, "You make moloss, may moloss, my moloss, azems moloss 12. Eka pies, by why sign to see it, my lord I my I say, where is it, We see it as I kalels it to kakadabesko kai I suksabiki mi sakai like I sa I sa ta sa I saist because on a taste be says the sick it's this the bell roads is at about by the said that it's that bell we don't the sad broken walls like ribs jutting out of the earth. Some argued it should be burned to the ground. Others said it should stand as a warning. In the end, the man who had bought the land for cattle cleared it away, entirely leveling the ground, until only a faint outline of foundation stones remained. Grass grew where the parlor had once stood. Cows grazed where the girls had once been. Sealed in darkness, and yet for those who lived nearby the land never truly felt ordinary. Again children still whispered about it as they walked home from school, pointing to the hollow where the Durnham place had once stood. They told each other stories of ghostly girls with hair like cobwebs peering out from behind trees. They dared each other to walk the hollow at night, claiming that if you listened close, you could hear the faint sound of someone whispering "mother" over and over, carried on the wind. Grown thin with time, some laughed it off as childish fancy, but others, especially the old ones, did not laugh. They knew too well that the line between ghost stories and memory is thin. The discovery of the Durnham daughters did more than just uncover a crime. It unsettled the way people thought about the past. For 100 years, folks had carried an uneasy feeling in their hearts about that family, but had convinced themselves it was nothing, just imagination, just gossip. Now they realized it had been truth all along. The past had been darker than they had allowed themselves to believe, and if it could happen in Clayton, it could happen anywhere, behind any door, in any family. That was the horror that lingered long after the graves were filled, and yet there were those who felt a strange kind of peace too. For finally the girls had been found. Finally, their voices, written on paper and hidden in walls, had been heard at last. For nearly a century, they had been silenced by wood and nails, by fear and by secrecy. But now their story had broken free, carried on the lips of neighbors, told in newspapers, read in faraway cities. They were no longer shadows. They were daughters, with names Clara, Anna, Mary, and they had been remembered. But the story was not yet finished. For among the papers and ribbons and scraps of cloth found in the walls, there had been something else. Something not shown to the press right away. Something Sheriff Miller had held back from public eyes. It was a single page torn from a ledger in Samuel Durnham's handwriting. Neat, precise letters, dated in the summer of 1868, the very year Mary had vanished. The page listed 3 names: Clara, Anna, Mary. Beside each was a date, and beside each date a single word completed, asterisk. The page lay flat on the sheriff's desk, its edges browned by time, its ink still sharp and precise. Samuel Durnham's hand was unmistakable. Older folks who had seen his ledgers for cattle and corn swore to it. They remembered the man's careful script, neat as a schoolteacher's. Without flourish, without softness, the name stared back with a cruel simplicity: Clara, Anna, Mary. 3 girls, 3 daughters, 3 vanishings. And beside each, a word so cold, so final, completed. The sheriff read it once, then again, as if some hidden meaning might change the weight of it. But there was none. It was none. It was not a mistake, not a random list. It was a record as clear as any. A count of debts or harvests, each name, each date, each girl marked off like tasks, finished when the ledger page became known. Whispers turned to outrage. For 100 years, townsfolk had carried unease. Now they carried anger. The daughters had not vanished into thin air. They had not run away or been sent west. They had been kept locked in the walls of their own home by their own father and mother. And the ledger proved it had been no accident, no rash act of madness. It was deliberate, it was ordered, it was planned and recorded like farm work or business. Samuel had not only done it, he had written it down in ink, as though he believed there was nothing to be ashamed of, as though it were his right. Sheriff Miller guarded the paper closely. Some demanded it be burned, that no one should lay eyes on such evil. Others said it should be displayed in the courthouse as proof of what had happened, but the sheriff held it quiet. He feared what it might stir, and feared to what it meant for. If Samuel could do such things and record them so coldly, then what did that say about the silence of the town? Had they too not been complicit in some way? Had they not turned away when the daughters vanished? Had they not avoided questions because it was easier, because Samuel's silence and Margaret's sharp eyes had been enough to keep them from knocking on that door? The ledger was not only Samuel's guilt, it was theirs too. The pastors in town preached fiery sermons in the weeks that followed. Some spoke of sin, of the devil's hand guiding Samuel and Margaret. Others spoke of pride and secrecy, of how hiding evil lets it grow. One old preacher raised his voice until it shook the rafters, warning that if a community lets shadows linger in its midst without bringing them to light, those shadows will consume not just a family, but everyone who lives nearby. The church was packed for weeks, not only with believers, but with people who needed to sit among neighbors to feel less alone in their fear. Yet, the ledger also drew the curious from beyond. Clayton reporters from Montgomery returned, sniffing for more headlines. Men with cameras came, clumsy tripods over their shoulders. They asked endless questions. What else had been found in the house? Who had known the Durnhams best? Did anyone ever hear screams? Did no one ever wonder about the sealed windows, the nailed curtains? Some townsfolk answered, some turned away, some answered with anger, telling outsiders that they could not possibly understand the weight of carrying whispers for a century. But the reporters kept coming, and the Durnham story spread further with each retelling. It reached Birmingham, then Atlanta, then New York, and beyond. Soon the name Durnham was known not only in Clayton, but across the country. The effect on the town was strange and heavy. On one hand, it brought shame. Clayton became the town of the Walled Daughters, a place spoken of in hushed tones in newspaper columns. On the other hand, it brought a grim kind of pride, for the truth had been revealed after so long, and the girls had been laid to rest with honor. There was even talk of putting a stone in the town square, not with Samuel's name or Margaret's, but with the names of Clara, Anna, and Mary, so that no one would ever forget what had been done and what had been hidden. But the ledger carried more questions than answers. Why had Samuel written it down? What did completed mean? Was it only death? Was it something darker? Was it ritual? Some whispered of curses, pointing out how the Durnham sons never married, never fathered children, as though some judgment had followed the family line. Others whispered of old traditions, long since twisted, that demanded daughters be sacrificed to protect land or bloodline. They pointed to the fact that while neighbors had suffered hunger and ruin during the Civil War, the Durnham farm had prospered. They asked aloud whether such prosperity had been bought at a price. No one could prove such things, but no one could dismiss them either. Not when the ledger lay on the sheriff's desk. Sheriff himself grew restless in those weeks. He would wake at night hearing the words in his head, the cold voice of Samuel repeating them like a tally. Clara, Anna, Mary completed. Sometimes he dreamed of the walls closing around him, of scratching in the dark, of voices whispering "Mother," until he woke sweating in his bed. He was an old man by then, near the end of his service, and he wondered whether the burden of the Durnham secret had fallen on him at the last, because he would not live long enough to carry it for decades. More he took to walking at night, passing by the empty lot where the farmhouse had stood. He would pause and look at the grass that now grew over the stones, and in the silence of the hollow he sometimes thought he heard faint crying carried on the wind. Families in Clayton began to treat the hollow differently. Some avoided it altogether, steering their wagons wide. Others went there on purpose, leaving flowers at the edge of the lot as if it were sacred ground. Some children still dared each other to creep close at night, but even they spoke more softly than before. The hollow had become more than land. It had become memory and warning at once. As months turned to years and years into decades, the story of the Durnhams hardened into legend, the details blurred in retelling, but the heart of it remained. Parents told their children never To hide their sins, never to keep secrets in their houses, neighbors looked harder at one another, wary of silence and heavy curtains. Even as the world changed, the Durnhams remained a reminder that evil is not only found in faraway places or in books of monsters. It can be found in a farmhouse on the edge of town, carried out by a father who keeps ledgers and a mother who sews ribbons into her daughters' hair. By the 1970s, long after the graves had settled, long after the sheriff and all his generation had passed away, the Durnham story returned once more. Scholars came down from universities curious about folklore and hidden crimes. They dug through courthouse records, they read faded newspapers, they searched for descendants. None remained. The Durnham line had ended, as if the earth itself had swallowed it. They studied the ledger page, now kept in archives, its ink still as black as the stir. As the day it had dried, they spoke to old folks who remembered hearing their grandparents whisper about Clara or Anna or Mary, and from all of it, they pieced together a history that was at once factual and haunting. They published books, they gave lectures, and the name Durnham spread yet again, carried not by gossip now, but by history, and, with each retelling, the questions grew sharper. Did Samuel act alone, or did Margaret wield the crueler hand? Was it punishment? Was it sacrifice? Was it madness, or something colder still? And why 3 times? Why wait until each daughter was 16? Why mark it down as if it were an account to balance? No one living could answer. The truth had gone into the ground with Samuel and Margaret, leaving only silence behind. Yet that silence spoke louder than words, for silence is the sound of neighbors who look away, of children who do not laugh, of curtains nailed shut against the sun. And when people spoke of the Durnhams, they spoke not only of what was found in the UHA walls, but of the silence that let it happen. The town itself could not escape the shadow entirely. Visitors still came driving slow past the hollow, asking where the house had stood. Some claimed to feel cold as they passed, even on the hottest summer days. Some said they saw movement among the trees, a flicker of white like a dress vanishing into mist. The locals grew used to it, sometimes weary, sometimes protective. For though the Durnhams had brought shame, they also belonged to Clayton. The story was theirs to carry, not outsiders, and so year after year, the town kept the graves tended, kept the memory alive, and let the rest remain buried. Yet, Marith made buried. Still the ledger haunted them, that single page, that single word, completed, left open a door in people's minds. Some believed there were more pages lost to time, perhaps still hidden somewhere in the earth, or tucked into some attic chest. They imagined what else Samuel might have recorded, what else he might have done. Some believed that the 3 names were not the end, but only the beginning, and that perhaps there had been others before or after, hidden so carefully that no workman had yet uncovered them. Such thoughts spread fear like smoke, but they could not be banished. Not when the evidence of 3 bodies had already been found in the walls, and so the story lived on, generation after generation. A story told in whispers at bedtime, a story spoken by old men on porches as dusk settled, a story that bound the town together in unease, but also in shared memory. The Durnhams had hidden their daughters away, but in the end, the truth had clawed free. The walls had been broken, the ledger uncovered, the graves filled with flowers, and though silence had ruled for 93 years, it could not rule forever. But the legend did not end in Clayton alone. For as the years stretched on and the story reached beyond Alabama, people in other places began to claim they too had found things hidden in old houses, letters behind plaster, shoes stuffed into chimneys, dolls bricked into walls. Sometimes these discoveries were harmless tokens of superstition. Sometimes they were signs of darker things, and always the name Durnham was whispered in connection, as if the story had become a symbol, a warning written across the land itself. The house may have fallen, the family may have died, but the secret they had hidden for 93 years would never truly be buried. By the close of the 20th century, the Durnham story was no longer just part of Clayton's past. It had become woven into the town's very identity, Even children who never saw the old farmhouse or knew the faces of Clara, Anna, or Mary whispered their names on autumn nights. Teachers spoke of the discovery in classrooms, warning that secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, will one day come to light at the county fair. The tale sometimes rose in ghost stories told by lantern glow as the Ferris wheel turned against the night sky. The Durnham name had faded from flesh and blood, but not from the soil of Alabama. For older generations, it was never entertainment, but a wound and a warning. They remembered the day the walls gave up their dead, the church bells tolling for long delayed funerals, the shame that swept through the community like fever to them. The horror was not only what the parents had done, but what neighbors failed to do. Silence had kept. The girls in the dark silence had kept the truth buried as decades passed. Families retold the story less as crime and more as parable. They taught their children never to let fear keep them quiet, never to look away when someone needed help. They said evil thrives in silence, like mold in dark corners. If you let it grow, it will rot a house from within. In this way, Clara, Anna, and Mary's memory became not just tragedy, but instruction. But memory is restless, and in Clayton, it clung to the land. The hollow where the farmhouse once stood never lost its strangeness. Even when cattle grazed there, some swore the air was colder, as if the earth still exhaled the chill of the sealed walls. Some claimed they saw pale figures among the trees at dusk, voices thin as breath, calling mother on the wind. A sheriff's grandson once swore he heard scratching underfoot as he crossed the site, though only grass and stone lay beneath. Then there were the letters, the scraps of paper found in the walls, written by a young hand, begging to be let out, fragile and blurred. By time they carried more power than the bones, for bones are silent, but words speak across centuries. Each line was a voice of defiance, a child's plea to a mother who never answered. Many who read them wept, unable to continue their preservation. Turned Clara, Anna, and Mary from folklore into history. Their voices had outlived the walls that silenced them. By the 1990s, the story drew national attention. Filmmakers and writers arrived with cameras and microphones. Some locals felt it reopened wounds, while others believed the world needed to know. The films showed the yellowed letters, the empty hollow, and spread the tale beyond Alabama. The Durnhams were no longer just Clayton's burden. They had become America's cautionary tale. And still the question lingered, why had Samuel and Margaret done it? The ledger left behind carried only one word, completed. Some said Samuel feared sin in his daughters and destroyed them before they could bloom. Others believed Margaret envied their youth, twisting strictness into cruelty. Still others whispered of superstition or bargains with unseen forces. The truth was buried with them, and the silence of that one word was perhaps the cruelest part. The Durnhams became less a family and more a symbol, a warning of how silence can rot a house from within, a reminder that evil often hides behind ordinary Sunday faces. Their farmhouse was gone, their line ended, yet the story lived on, passed from sermons to books, from lips to film, always the same at its core. A father and mother sealed their daughters in the walls, and for 93 years the town carried silence until truth broke free. Today, the graves of Clara, Anna, and Mary still stand, weathered stones, plain and unadorned, side by side like sisters reunited at last. Flowers appear. They're still left by strangers or children brought on school trips. Those who visit often whisper promises, not just prayers, promises to remember to speak when silence feels easier to guard against. Shadows in their own homes. That is the true ending of the Durnham story. It is not simply horror or mystery, but a lesson. Evil thrives not because it is strong, but because others let it hide. Silence can strangle as surely as hands, and memory matters because voices, even sealed in walls, can rise again. Remembrance itself becomes justice. For Samuel and Margaret left only shame, while their daughters left voices finally freed. So when the wind blows through Clayton and the cicadas hum in the trees, some say you can still hear it. A whisper like paper unfolding a reminder that no wall, no silence, and no century can keep the truth hidden forever.